To check the used names list and then read the story. The band names are Cara, Danielle, Marcus, Jess, Nadia, Ray, Simone, Evelyn, Lena, Priya, Tomoko, Owen, Claire, Bethany, Deshawn, Patricia, Violet, Holt, Yolanda, Ronnie, Iris, Ren, Salah, Theo, Harriet, Margot, Imogen, Beatrix, Adeline, Tobias, Winter, Coraline, Audra, Roxanne, Howard, Frank, Kelsey, Gerald, Meredith, Bryn, Callum, Dex, Hadley, Brielle, Pemberton, Birch. New names I'll use: Veda, narrator, Sloane, sister, Declan, billionaire, protector, Loretta, mother. My stepsister announced her engagement at my own birthday dinner. She stood up mid-meal, tapped her glass, smiled at everyone like she'd been rehearsing for years, and said, "This is the happiest night of our family's life." No one looked at me, not even to apologize, and the man who finally made them see me wasn't my father, wasn't a cousin who'd heard enough, wasn't anyone who owed me anything. He was someone I'd known for 11 weeks. When he stood up in the middle of a rooftop restaurant and told my stepsister, "Speak to her like that again and we're done here," I didn't cry. I'd run out of that particular reflex a long time ago. What I felt instead was something quieter, something that had been waiting behind my ribs for almost a decade, finally exhaling. People ask me now if I regret staying silent as long as I did. Honestly, I'm not sure silence is the right word for what I did. Silence suggests a choice. What I did was more like holding my breath underwater, convinced that if I just stayed still long enough, the current would eventually carry me somewhere better. It didn't. But I found my way up anyway. I should start at the beginning, or at least the beginning that matters. My father remarried when I was 9. I remember the weekend clearly because I'd been promised we'd go to the science museum, just the two of us. We hadn't done that in almost a year. Instead, he sat me down at the kitchen table with a glass of apple juice I didn't ask for and told me about Loretta and her daughter, who was 7 at the time, and how we were all going to be a family now. He said it the way you announce a vacation destination, upbeat, final. Not really a question. My stepsister's name was Sloane. She was small and loud and had this particular gift for making adults feel like they'd done something wonderful just by existing near her. My father called her a firecracker. Loretta called her spirited. I called her nothing because I'd learned early that naming what bothered me only turned it back on me somehow. By middle school, the shape of things had settled into something I stopped questioning. Sloane got the bigger bedroom because she had more stuff. Sloane got picked up from school because she had more activities. Sloane got the front seat, the first piece of cake, the details remembered about her school projects and her friend drama and her developing opinions about movies and music. I learned to sit slightly back from the center of every room we shared, not dramatically, just enough. I did well in school, not because anyone pushed me, but because it was the one place where the effort I put in had a direct and honest relationship with the result I got back. I got a partial scholarship to study environmental science at a state school 2 hours from home. My father came to my graduation with Loretta and Sloane, who spent most of the ceremony scrolling through her phone. At the reception lunch after, Loretta mentioned 3 times that Sloane had just been accepted to an accelerated business program. My father nodded each time like it was new information. I didn't correct anyone. I thanked them for coming and drove back to campus alone to pack up my dorm. I moved to Denver 2 years after graduation for a research position with a nonprofit focused on water resource management. It wasn't glamorous work. A lot of spreadsheets, a lot of grant writing, a lot of early mornings reading reports that most people would find deeply boring. I loved it. I'd found something that asked something real from me and gave something real back. I didn't go home often. Partly distance, partly cost, partly the particular exhaustion that comes from visiting people who love you in a way that keeps leaving you slightly thinner than before. But I went home for my 30th birthday. Loretta had called and suggested a family dinner, just us, somewhere nice. She said the word celebrate twice. I should have paid attention to how unfamiliar that word sounded coming from her in reference to me, but I didn't. I bought a new dress. I drove to the airport at 5 in the morning. I wanted to believe it. The restaurant was a rooftop place in the city. Exposed brick, string lights, the kind of menu that has one word per dish and expects you to already know what it means. Everyone was already seated when I arrived. My father, Loretta, Sloane, and Sloane's boyfriend, a man I'd never met, who was introduced to me so quickly I didn't catch his name. I sat down. Someone had ordered appetizers. I hadn't been consulted, but that was fine. We were midway through the main course when Sloane stood up. She tapped her glass. She smiled. She looked at her boyfriend, whose name I would later learn was Griffin, and she said, "We have something to share." And then she announced their engagement. The table erupted. Loretta covered her mouth. My father pushed back his chair to hug her. Griffin accepted handshakes and someone at a nearby table started clapping. The whole rooftop felt warm and bright and rearranged around this one moment. I sat with my fork in my hand. At some point, my father sat back down, looked at me across the table and said, "Isn't that wonderful, Veda?" I said yes. I said congratulations. I smiled in the way I'd been smiling at things like this for 20 years. After dessert, when the bill had been settled and Loretta and my father were taking pictures on the rooftop railing, Sloane came and sat in the empty chair beside me. She smelled like the perfume she'd been wearing since she was 16, and I'd learned to associate it with a specific kind of tension. "You're not upset, are you?" she asked. Not like she was worried, more like she was checking a box. "Of course not," I said. "Congratulations, Sloane." She tilted her head. "It's just, I know you're a little sensitive about the attention thing." She said it lightly, like she was being considerate. And I figured, since we're all here anyway, it made sense. "You don't mind, do you?" I looked at her for a moment. She was waiting for me to say no. I don't mind. I knew the shape of this conversation so well I could have stepped through it blindfolded. "I don't mind," I said. She patted my hand. "You're so easygoing. I love that about you." I went back to my hotel room that night and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. I didn't cry. I was 30 years old. It was my birthday. My stepsister had used my birthday dinner to announce her engagement in front of my father and her mother and a man she was marrying, and nobody had said anything except wonderful and congratulations, and isn't that something? I wasn't in any of the photos they posted that night. I checked, because I had to know. The next morning, I went for a walk before anyone else was awake. Denver had made me a morning person. I walked to a coffee shop 3 blocks from the hotel, ordered something simple, and sat at a table by the window watching the street start to move. My phone buzzed. A calendar notification, 2 weeks from now, project presentation, Regional Water Summit, Portland. I'd been preparing for 8 months. I was the lead presenter. 45 minutes in front of directors, funders, and 3 state agencies. I looked at the notification for a long time, then I opened my contacts, scrolled to a name I'd added 4 months ago after a professional development conference, Declan Marsh. He was a sustainability investor. We'd had a 40-minute conversation about aquifer depletion and public infrastructure funding that had turned in 2 hours and then coffee after the panel. He'd given me his card. I'd texted him a paper I thought he'd find useful. He'd replied the same day with 4 paragraphs of actual engagement and a question I had to think about for a week. We'd been talking regularly since, not romantically. Or at least I hadn't named it that. I told myself it was professional. It mostly was, but the conversations had started going longer than they needed to, and neither of us seemed to be in a hurry to end them. I texted him, "In town for a few days." "Rough night, tell me something interesting." He replied in 4 minutes, "There's a water reclamation project in Jordan that just hit a milestone. Want the details or you looking for distraction?" I smiled at my phone in the empty coffee shop. "Both," I wrote back. He called instead of texting. We talked for an hour and a half. I didn't tell him about my birthday. I didn't need to yet. But something about the sound of his voice, the ease of it, the way he asked questions like he actually wanted to know the answers, settled something in me that the night before had unsettled. When I flew back to Denver, I felt something I hadn't in a while. Not happy exactly. More like oriented. Like I'd remembered where I was going. The next several weeks were full. The summit presentation went well. Better than well. Afterward, a program director from a federal agency pulled me aside and asked if I'd be open to a conversation about a long-term consulting contract. I said yes. I tried not to let my voice shake. I don't think it did. Declan and I had dinner in Denver 2 weeks after that. He was in the city for something else, and we planned it like it was nothing unusual. which I suppose it wasn't, except that by the time I got home, I was fairly certain I was in trouble in the particular way that's hard to plan around. He texted when I was already inside. That was the best conversation I've had in a long time. I mean that. I put the phone face down on the counter and breathed. We had dinner again. And again. By the 5th time, we both stopped pretending it was incidental. I told him things I hadn't told most people. About Denver. About the work. About growing up in a house where I'd learned to make myself easy to overlook. I didn't perform it as a sad story. It was just the facts of a thing, laid out plainly. He listened. He asked follow-up questions that showed he'd actually heard me. He didn't try to fix it or reframe it or tell me families were complicated as though that explained everything away. He said once, quietly, "I think you've been very patient with people who didn't earn it." I didn't know what to do with that, so I looked out the window for a moment and then changed the subject. But I kept it. I turned it over in my mind for weeks afterward. About 2 months in, Loretta called. She did this occasionally, always with an agenda beneath the check-in, the way a current moves under still water. This time the agenda surfaced quickly. The engagement party was being planned, a venue in the city. She needed help coordinating with the caterer because Sloane was overwhelmed with the venue and the guest list and her work schedule. Could I look into the floral options? Did I still have that contact from my college roommate who'd done event work? I sat with the phone against my ear. "Mom," I said, not for the first time in my life, but with a precision I hadn't used before. I wasn't consulted about any of this. "I know, sweetheart, that's why I'm consulting you now." "You're not consulting me. You're asking me to do logistics for my stepsister's engagement party." Silence. Then Veda, she's your family. She used my birthday dinner to announce her engagement without asking if that was okay. Another silence. Softer this time. I thought for a moment I'd actually reached something. Then, she was excited. "You know how she gets." I knew exactly how she gets. That was the whole point. "I'm not available to help with the florals," I said. "I hope it's a beautiful party." I hung up. I sat on my kitchen floor for a few minutes, not because I was falling apart, more because the floor felt like the right altitude for what I'd just done. Then I got up, made tea, and called Declan. He didn't say "good for you" or "you deserve better." He said, "How do you feel?" And then he actually listened to the answer. The engagement party was 3 weeks later. I didn't attend. Loretta texted twice. My father called once and left a voicemail that was clearly Loretta's words delivered in his voice. I listened to it, then set the phone down and went for a run. When I came back, I replied to my father directly, "I love you. I'm not in a place to participate in events where I'm not considered a person. I hope we can talk about that when you're ready." He didn't respond for 4 days. When he did, it was 2 sentences. "I hear you, let me think." I didn't know what that meant. But it was more than I'd gotten before. Declan flew in the weekend of the engagement party, not because of it. He had a board meeting. But we had dinner Saturday night, and I told him more than I'd planned to, and he sat with all of it without trying to compress it into something easier to hold. At the end of the night, outside the restaurant, he said, "I want to keep doing this, whatever this is, but I want to be honest about it." I looked at him for a moment. "I'd like that too," I said, "but I'm not easy to be around right now. I'm in the middle of something I'm still figuring out." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to be finished." I drove home that night with the windows down even though it was cold. Something had shifted. Not dramatically. The way a bone resets. Quiet and significant and felt before it's understood. We made things official not long after that. No announcement, no performance. Just the two of us deciding, in the way two people sometimes do, that they've been in something for a while and it's time to call it what it is. The call from Sloane came 6 weeks later. She knew about Declan. Social media, or Loretta, or the way information travels in families, whether you share it or not. She asked to have lunch when she was passing to Denver. I almost said no. I said yes instead, because I was curious about what she'd actually say to my face. She showed up in a blazer she'd clearly bought recently, the tag still leaving a faint mark at the collar. She ordered a salad she barely touched. She smiled in the way she always smiled when she wanted something. She asked about Declan, how long we'd been together, what he did. I answered plainly. She commented, 3 times across the meal that I'd really changed, said it in the tone people use when they mean I don't recognize you anymore and I'm not sure I like it. At one point she said, "You always used to be so low maintenance, Veda." She meant it as a compliment. She meant it the way she'd always meant everything she said to me, which was as a gentle reminder of what role I was supposed to be playing. I looked at her across the table. I said, "I'm the same. I think the difference is that I've stopped making it easy to ignore me." Her smile held, but something behind it went flat. She left without finishing her coffee. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. Which is better? 3 weeks after that lunch, Declan's company was being profiled in a regional business magazine. They wanted a photo of him at one of their portfolio properties, a renovated mixed-use building downtown that housed a community kitchen and a small business incubator. He asked me to come. It wasn't a formal event, just a photographer and a journalist. I'd been in the building twice before and liked the way it smelled, like new wood and something being cooked several floors below. Sloane and Loretta were in the city that day for a wedding dress appointment. I didn't know this until I was already inside the building's ground floor café, getting coffee while Declan finished with the photographer. They walked in because the café was the kind of place you'd walk into, and because the city is sometimes cruel in its smallness. Loretta saw me first. Her expression shifted through 3 things so quickly I could only catch 2 of them. Then she composed herself and came over, Sloane 2 steps behind. "Veda." Loretta touched my arm like she always did, proprietary and warm and hard to object to. "What are you doing here?" I told her. Plainly, that Declan was here for something, that I was waiting for him. Sloane looked around the cafe with the kind of slow survey that's meant to be noticed. Then she looked back at me. "This is his building?" "One of them," I said. She tilted her head. Something moved behind her eyes. It wasn't quite envy. It was more like the recalibration that happens when the thing you've sorted someone into stops fitting the container. "Well," she said, "you certainly landed on your feet." I knew that tone. I'd known it for 20 years. It was the tone that made a compliment feel like a small cut, plausibly deniable, leaving no mark you could hold up as evidence. "I built a good life," I said. "I've been building it for a while." She smiled. "Of course you have." She glanced at Loretta, a flicker, the kind sisters and mothers have. Then back to me. "You always needed someone to believe in you, though. Didn't you? You were always a little bit that way." I opened my mouth, but I didn't need to say anything. Declan had come through from the back hallway. He'd heard enough. He crossed the cafe without hurrying, touched the back of my shoulder briefly, and looked at Sloane directly, not with anger, with the particular calm of someone who has decided exactly how much he's going to tolerate. "I'm Declan," he said, not introducing himself to be polite, but to mark where he was standing. "And I want to be clear about something." He looked at Sloane steadily. "Veda is the most capable person I've spent serious time with in years. She doesn't need anyone to believe in her. She's been the one doing the work while other people took the credit, so I'd ask you to speak to her accordingly." Sloane blinked. Loretta's hand tightened on her coffee cup. "This is a private conversation," Sloane said, her voice careful now. "It stopped being private," Declan said, "when you started it in my building." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move closer. He simply stood there, with a steadiness that made the room feel reoriented around him, and said what he'd said. Loretta murmured something about needing to get to their appointment. Sloane straightened her blazer, looked at me once more with an expression I couldn't read and didn't try to, and followed her mother toward the door. When they'd gone, the cafe settled back into itself. The barista behind the counter had found something very important to look at on the register screen. 2 people at a corner table resumed their conversation. I turned to Declan. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. "Do you want your coffee? It's getting cold." I laughed. Actual, unrehearsed laughter, the kind that catches you off guard by arriving without permission. He handed me my cup. We sat at the nearest table and stayed for another hour talking about nothing important. That was the moment I stopped waiting to feel like I'd earned my own life, not because of what he said, because of how ordinary it felt afterward. No drama, no fracture, no one needing to be carried. Just a cup of coffee getting cold and someone handing it back to me. My father called that evening. He'd heard from Loretta. He said very little at first. I waited. He said, eventually, I think I've let a lot of things go that I shouldn't have. I don't have a good explanation for why. He didn't dress it up. He didn't offer a revision of history. He just said, I'm sorry, Veda. I should have seen what was happening. I didn't cry. I didn't tell him it was fine, which it wasn't entirely. I said, thank you for saying that. I'd like to figure out what comes next between us if you're open to it. He said he was. We talked for another 20 minutes about nothing related to Sloane or Loretta or any of it, just catching up. His garden. My project. A book he'd started reading. The most ordinary conversation I'd had with my father in years. And somehow, the most honest. I'd spent a long time believing that needing to be seen was a kind of weakness, that the right thing was to keep your head down and let the work speak and not require anything from anyone. I'd been very proud of that belief. It had gotten me through a lot of years, but somewhere in the last few months, I'd started to understand that asking to be seen isn't the same as demanding applause. It's just the minimum. The basic agreement that you're in the room. Sloane texted me 3 weeks later. A short message, no preamble. I've been thinking about what happened at the café. I wasn't fair to you. I don't know if I've ever been, if I'm honest. I'm not sure how to fix that, but I wanted to say it. I read it twice. Then I put the phone down and went back to the grant proposal I was finishing. I didn't respond that day. I thought about what I actually wanted from her. Not what would be gracious, not what would be easy, not what would make the family dinner table comfortable again. What I actually wanted. The next day I wrote back, thank you. I'm not sure what comes next either. But I appreciate you saying it. That was enough, for now. The consulting contract came through. 6 months, with a renewal clause. More than I'd been making at the nonprofit, with more visibility and more impact. I signed it on a Tuesday morning at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee that had gone lukewarm. I didn't celebrate exactly. I sat for a moment, quietly with the pen still in my hand. I thought about the girl who used to eat near the kitchen at other people's events, balancing plates on her lap and telling herself it was fine. I didn't pity her. I understood her. She was doing what she knew how to do. She held on. She built something quietly, in rooms where no one was watching. The thing about building something when no one's watching is that it's still built when they finally look. I submitted the first deliverable on the federal contract 2 weeks later. The program director sent back a 2-sentence email. This is exactly what we needed. Thank you for the precision. I printed it out. Not for anyone else. I taped it to the inside of my cabinet door where I'd see it every morning getting coffee. A private marker. A note from the world I'd built that said, yes. This is real. You made this. Declan asked me once, in the easy middle of an ordinary evening, whether I regretted all the years I'd spent staying quiet in that family. I thought about it for a while. No, I said. I think I needed to understand it completely before I could stop. I looked at him. If I'd fought back at 15, I would have wasted a decade on a war. Instead, I just left and built something they couldn't touch. He didn't say anything. He reached over and held my hand the way you hold something you're not trying to fix. Some families teach you your worth by exceeding it. Mine taught me. Mine by failing to see it. I'm not sure which lesson lands harder. I'm not sure which lesson lands harder. I'm not sure it matters anymore. I know what I built. I know who showed up for me when it cost them something and when it didn't. I know what it feels like to stand in a room and not be afraid of taking up the space I've earned. I don't need a spotlight. I just needed a room where the lights were honest. I found it. I built the rest myself. If you've ever been the one in the corner of someone else's frame, I want you to know something. You are not background. You never were. Sometimes the people closest to you are just the worst possible judges of what you're worth. Step back from them far enough and you'll see it, not because someone else validates it. Because you finally stop letting their version of you block your own view. Build the thing. Sign the contract. Walk into the room. You don't need their permission to be the main character of your own life. You never did. I used to think that staying quiet was a form of strength, that if I just kept my head down and did the work and didn't ask for anything, it would eventually count for something. I believed that for a long time, long enough that it stopped feeling like a belief and started feeling like just the way things were. What I understand now is that silence isn't strength. It's just silence. And the people around you will interpret it however is most convenient for them. In my case, they interpret it as agreement, as acceptance, as proof that I didn't need much, didn't want much, could be relied upon to take up as little space as possible and be grateful for whatever was left over. The thing about living that way is that it works, in a narrow sense, for a while. Nobody fights with you. The table stays peaceful. You don't have to face the particular discomfort of someone looking at you with resentment for having asked for what you deserved. But the cost accumulates quietly, the way interest does, invisible until the number gets too large to ignore. For me, the number got too large the night my stepsister stood up at my birthday dinner and made it about herself. Not because that single moment was so devastating, but because I finally let myself see it clearly for what it was. Not an accident, not a one-time thoughtlessness, but the natural outcome of a pattern I had allowed for years without naming it. That recognition was uncomfortable in a way I hadn't expected. Because when you stop pretending a pattern doesn't exist, you also have to stop pretending you had no part in sustaining it. I had, not by being weak, by being too patient with people who were taking advantage of that patience. There's a difference between grace and self-erasure, and I had spent a long time confusing the two. What changed wasn't one dramatic moment. It was a series of small decisions. Hanging up the phone when Loretta asked me to coordinate florals for Sloane's engagement party. Telling my father plainly what I needed even when I didn't know if he'd hear it. Saying yes to work that scared me. Letting Declan in slowly, honestly, without performing certainty, I didn't feel. Each of those decisions was quiet, and each one cost something, and each one built something too. When Declan stood in that cafe and said what he said to Sloane, it mattered not because I needed someone to defend me, but because it was the first time I'd let someone stand beside me in a moment like that instead of handling it alone. That's its own kind of growth. Letting people in, trusting that being seen isn't the same as being dependent. Sloane's text weeks later was short and imperfect and probably took her longer to send than I'll ever know. I didn't forgive her in that moment, not completely. But I wrote back, because holding on to the shape of an old wound long after it stopped bleeding is its own kind of trap, and I wasn't interested in being trapped anymore. What I know now is this. The life you build in the quiet, when no one is watching and no one is applauding, is still a life. It's still real. And when someone finally looks, it's all still there. Every hour you put in, every decision you made, every room you walked into, even when you weren't sure you belonged. You built it. It counts. And no one can rewrite that without your permission. Don't give them permission.